Hello and welcome to the Film Ireland podcast, where we delve into the stories, talent and creativity behind the Irish screen industries. In this podcast, we catch up with Doc Arena host and film director Ross Whitaker. Ross's nail-biting documentary Beat The Lotto hit cinemas on the 4th of July, so have a listen to the trailer here.
And we have the man who is the author of this book, which is called Win the Lotto. You're in a syndicate yourself, aren't you?
Yes, indeed.
And how many times did you win the jackpot?
Well, we haven't won the jackpot yet.
Have you won anything yet?
No. Well, as they say down in Cork, everything's possible. And of course, the rest is history.
What can you make of Stefan?
He's once off. There'll never be another one like him. He had all these systems. They never worked, but he was a good man at selling them.
When I calculated the number of combinations, I felt this was an opportunity to beat the lottery. That's when the story really starts.
It was a grim time in Ireland.
Stefan mentioned to me that he had this great plan to buy all the tickets in the lotto. This seemed to me manna from heaven.
I will put together a group of people and we'll do this.
I thought, jizz, I'll never come out of this one alive.
£19 million jackpot this weekend.
We were home.
The button was pushed.
We try to spread it around the country, of course.
And there was a great buzz. It was like owning 5 horses in the one race and only 5 runners.
A number of agents reported to the National Lottery that large sums of cash were being spent.
National Lottery shutting down the machines. They're fighting back.
We will do whatever is necessary to protect the game for our regular players.
It was huge news. If we didn't get the numbers on, it was all over.
$1 million gone down the drain.
Have they bought enough tickets?
Tonight's jackpot is now at £1.8 million. It remains to be seen if the syndicate has got its sums right.
Thank you so much for chatting with us, Ross.
No worries, happy to be here.
Oh my God, it was such an exciting watch. The tension, the hilarity, the humour, the pacing. It was just incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, look, we're delighted that people are having that response to it. And really, I suppose the tension, in a way, when you make a film like this, it's about people trying to pull off something that hadn't been done before, and maybe people thought wasn't possible, which was to buy all the combinations of the lottery and guarantee that win. So you're using some of those kind of heist or caper tropes, and you're hoping that you are managing to build attention and so on, because the worst thing that could happen is people come out and go like, that was grand, but if they come out and go like, oh, I was really tense at the end, then you think, okay, fantastic, we did something right.
Okay, so the story itself is a mathematician beating the odds after writing the book, and I think you set it up. It's so funny because it's so classically nostalgically Irish, like even that interview on Pat Kenny at the beginning where he kind of laughs at him and he's like, well, why don't you just win the lotto then? And he puts his money where his mouth is, which is excellent, and does that syndicate. But it has that element of nostalgia. It leans into this story, but also the people at the core of it are hilarious.
Yeah, I know. Well,
do you bring that out to them, or did you know that going in?
Well, I didn't really know much about them going in, to be honest. Like we located Stefan Klincewicz, who's the main character in the film. He was the mathematician who had kind of figured out, or I suppose probably a lot of people knew that there was a way of, if you bought all the combinations, then you probably had enough, you would win enough numbers to guarantee a win. But the issue would be that you wouldn't know if you were going to share it or not. So it'd be all very well buying all the tickets, but if 5 people also won, then it gets divided by 5 and you'd make a huge loss. So we got Stefan. It took a little while to locate him. We were starting with a blank page, and then he introduced us to another friend that was involved in the syndicate, and then that person introduced us to another couple of people, and then that led to another person. So it sort of worked like that, which was kind of interesting. You started with nothing, and then it just sort of gradually came together, and then it was just a matter of convincing each person as we went along. Some people were a little bit reticent because maybe they might have clients. A lot of people were involved in different kind of financial backgrounds and stuff like that. So they might have clients now who they don't necessarily want them to know that they got involved in this kind of caper back in the day, But ultimately, everyone did come on board. Everyone that we located. No, there were a few no's, I must admit, now that I think about it, but we had certainly the main characters and enough people to tell the story, and we knew nothing about them really. It was only when we sat down to interview them, which was during COVID, So it was kind of wheel them in, be as careful as possible, and follow all the protocols, obviously, and do the interviews. Didn't really get to hang around with them much beyond that because of what was going on more generally in society. And yeah, they just told their own story. And I think maybe a caper like this or a story like this, a proposition like this at the time probably attracts interesting bunch of people. You know what I mean? It's not your normal person who decides to put up, you know, their life savings and try and guarantee a lottery win. So yeah, I suppose you're probably going into it fairly confident that there'll be some interesting characters involved.
That's one of the key elements, is the humanity and characters at the heart of the story. And what you do as well is keep the pacing up, but give so much background. But it doesn't, again, for someone who's lived through it or understands it, it doesn't feel like too much because it's delivered in such a kind of funny way. Is that something you have, like that you know it's going to be like that? Or is it almost like you're kind of figuring out how to tell the story?
Yeah, I suppose what you do is you kind of map out the story on paper broadly before, you know, you talk to the people that you're going to interview in advance. And like, I don't tend to do like really in-depth research interviews because I don't want it to become a script in advance. I know that some people work that way and it's probably quite a good way to work, frankly, but I like to get a good sense of it from the different characters. And what's nice about it, I suppose, is when you speak to 6 people that are involved in the same story, you get 6 slightly different versions of it, and you're trying to kind of collate that into one truthful version of events. You know, if you've got 5 people talking about something and 3 people say it one way and then the other 2 say it 2 other ways completely, then you're probably going to go with the way the 3 people remember it. So you sort of bring it together like that. You have a sense of the narrative. You're kind of thinking a little bit in, I suppose, fictional script writing terms, in terms of your acts, you know, where are we going to be at what point in the story, you know. And in our film, it turned out to be, but we also had it kind of in the back of our minds that it should be around the halfway point where things go wrong, you know, and the midpoint of your film, thinking of things like how do you cut the climax correctly in terms of, you know, you don't want it to be unsatisfying. So you're trying to figure out, like, you know, what are the little elements of the ending of this story that might surprise you or kind of convince you that it's going one way for a moment, and then, you know, you get recognition that actually there's more to think about. So yeah, you are thinking about all those kind of typical storytelling mechanisms that are tried and trusted. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that you're not overdoing that to the extent that you're losing elements of the humanity and the heart and the real accounts of the people. So going into it, I think you can't be too scripted. You have to sort of try and keep your interviews going for as long as possible and just let them speak. And if they say something interesting, you're like, okay, let's go further down that avenue for a while. So it's a mixture of things. You know, you're going into the interviews thinking, okay, I have a good sense of how the story pans out, but you want to be really open to other things as well. So that's kind of the thought process I would use, definitely.
And something like this, again, where it's very much so you as a filmmaker reconstructing and retelling it, as opposed to, say, you documenting one person's journey. Do you find it more like you get to flex your muscles more in terms of how you tell it because there's so many different perspectives?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously you're working within a team as well, and you're talking to the cinematographer, Alex Sapienza, you know, you get producer, A-Dean, that I work with a lot, and we bounce things off each other. Nathan Nugent is the editor, maybe the best filmmaker in Ireland. You know, I mean, Nathan's extraordinary editor. So you're bouncing off all these people as well. And yeah, you're kind of, what attracted me actually to the story is exactly what you're saying. It's you know, I've done a lot of observational films, and you're kind of following what happens as it happens. Whereas with this, it happened in the past. It had a lot of interesting elements to it even before you start. You know, if you're thinking of a thriller, if you're making a movie and it's a thriller, then the idea of this film that sort of takes place over 3 days and has a ticking clock and things go wrong along the way, challenges, obstacles, and so on. Those are all the things that you put in your typical thriller script, but then actually it's real and they're real people and they have real emotions and it affects them in very real ways. So the combination of those things is really attractive. But yeah, as you're saying, like flexing, for want of a better word, whatever filmmaking muscles you have, you're trying to see, well, what can I bring to this genre, maybe to a certain extent, and how are we going to pace this and so on. And like honestly, we did spend a lot of time in the edit figuring these things out, and I think at times I could almost become a little bit too formulaic about it, and think like, okay, well, this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens. And you kind of have to like pull yourself back out of that. And Nathan will be very good for that, and trying to like, well, we want to find out more about this person if we can. And we want to capture the heart in this scene. And, we don't want it to be unsurprising. We don't want it to just flow as you would expect it to flow. So that kind of interaction between myself and Nathan, and then I suppose all of the people that watch cuts for us and so on, was really, really helpful in trying to get that balance right, not make it too predictable, include the human idiosyncrasies that make it surprising along the way. Yeah, so I think all those things are important. And probably for drama filmmakers, it's, if you're writing a script, it's to go, well, how can I make this different? Like, how can I make it idiosyncratic? How can I make it feel like this is a very special story, So that's what you're trying to do, I think, as you go along.
You were saying that, like, that language and that pacing. One of the funniest moments is when every single one of your interviewees have a different time frame. They're like 20 seconds, 2 minutes, within 4 minutes. Like, you just kind of like put it back together. Like, again, I think that the characters at the heart of this really bring that warmth and charm. But I really get that sense of your voice as a filmmaker, observing them and presenting that in a way that is very wittily put together.
Yeah, well, I always like to have some sense of humor in the films if I can. Like, it's really important. Even the most serious situations in life often have moments of at least dark humor. So it's nice to represent all those aspects of life. But with something like this, in the edit, you can have a lot of fun with material like that, and you're sort of, one thing over the years that I've really noticed is that people's interviews are not always wholly reliable. People's memories are not wholly reliable. And I think when you use kind of different accounts of things within the same film, and you kind of lean into that unreliability, and you're kind of saying, well, this is a version of what happened back then as well as people remember it. Like, I think that's important to kind of try and bring into those stories when you're looking backwards, because there's so many times, say with the more observational films, where you might be filming for a couple of years and you show the rough cut to a participant that's in the film and they say, I don't remember feeling like that, or I don't even remember that happening, or I don't remember saying that. And we reframe our past constantly, like that's the reality of it. And there are moments where we feel really down and we look back on it as a happy moment because we sort of reframed it, or it's put into a different context as life goes on. So I love that idea that, you can't fully rely on people's accounts of something that happened 30 years ago, and that this is actually a story. This is a story that they're telling. So, yeah, it's nice when you can kind of lean into those moments and show the audience that.
And in terms of the recreation, so I kind of want to break it down into the processes. So in terms of developing this, because it's a big story and you have a lot, like, and like the film itself is just like the expanse of how it's presented just feels really massive as the viewer. You mentioned you sent the first email in 2013. I was wondering, like, as a story, finding it, developing it, getting funders, could you talk me through that element of it?
Yeah, well, as always, it was really hard to get it funded. Like, I think the only project that was ever easy to get funded was the Katie Taylor documentary, because I suppose it was probably surprising that we managed to get access to Katie in that case, which happened in its own coincidental way. But it's very difficult to finance any film, I think, or there's very few that happen automatically or in a straightforward fashion. And yeah, I mean, the thing about this story was I was like wholly convinced from the very, very beginning that it was going to be a brilliant doc, or whether it's a brilliant doc, people can decide. But to my mind, I saw it as something that could be a brilliant doc. And like in some ways I think like, God, it could be even better like than it is, you know, like but it was a great story, I guess, to work with. And that was, I always believed that from the very, very beginning. So then it was kind of a case of like, how do you convince other people? And we did a promo back then. If you want to get into those kinds of details, like Michael Hart actually cut the promo, who's gone on to win like BAFTAs and Emmys and all sorts as an editor, really, really brilliant Irish editor. He would have done the Beckham series recently for Netflix and so on, like another great Irish filmmaker that's working at the moment. But I mean, other than Nathan that I mentioned, not myself. But so Michael did the original promo and did a brilliant job. And we took that kind of out to market and people liked it, but it was just really hard to get people over the line. And then we put it in for funding, got turned down by pretty much everyone in Ireland at different points. Some of that wasn't necessarily down to the story. Some of the things happen sometimes where there's a change of commissioning editor and they just want to sort of wipe the slate clean and move on, or you know, people just aren't convinced of something sometimes, or you know, something else is getting their attention and there's only limited funds. So you know, you have to be realistic about all these things, you know. But ultimately I kept feeling that it could be made, you know, and that it should be made and that I was definitely going to make it. But I also knew the nature of the story is you can't do it on a very low budget. Like, even though the film's relatively low budget, you need something, you know, because you do need to shoot reconstructions. You do need a lot of editing time. You want to shoot it on kind of nice cameras because you want to give it that cinematic feel, all that kind of stuff. It's not a shoestring type of project. So ultimately, came back around with a new proposition a few years ago, which was we convinced a couple of European broadcasters to give us sort of letters of pre-sale, which allowed us to go back and sort of show the market here that that people outside of Ireland could see there was something there, I suppose. And also when you are making a project with Screen Ireland, they can fund up to 65% of it. So you have to find the other 35% somewhere else, which can be a mixture of things like pre-sales. I actually got some private investors to participate in the film by showing them the promo and kind of making a case that I felt like it could make a little bit of money back and pay them back. And then that plus the Section 481 tax break. And, you know, I went back to Screen Ireland and said, look, can we get this over the line? And ultimately they agreed to. And actually what happened in the meantime was I made Katie, and that had gone down well, you know, so I think that helped as well. So like where you are at that moment in your career can help as well. So all of those things came together. I didn't manage to cut a long story short here.
No.
No, here's a long story.
I'm going to even like break down the pieces.
Okay.
So we're right. So
so ultimately I think that, so all these confluence of things came around. So that's sort of how it goes sometimes, I suppose, you know. It's a lot of things are timing. And then there was a new person in Screen Ireland at that time, newish, who had done Katie with me, which was Leslie McKim as exec producer. And then kind of went back to Leslie and said, look, you know, I want to try this again, and this is how I'm going to do it. And then we got it through. And then COVID hit, and then like we had to shoot a lot of it during COVID, which actually made it quite difficult. So yeah, that was kind of the story of how it came to be.
So then you get into production, it's COVID, you're shooting. In terms of structure, you have kind of beaten it out in a script form already, that you want to hit those points and have those points covered in certain areas. And it's like how you put them together then, you know, like are you at this point, have you already sourced all your archive? Are you finding moments? Because it's so, even though it happens in the past, it's so present, like the stakes are being upped, you're on the edge of your seat. Like, is that something that you have meticulously pre-planned, or are you constantly finding other ways to get that point across? Because it's not like you can just go out and film it. Like, it happened, you have to have it represented in some way.
Yeah, I mean, to break down the process, I would do what I call like a running order. And it's not a script. It's more like, these are the scenes. Yeah. And then when I go to interview people, I make sure I ask everyone about each of those, I mean, beats, or I make sure I ask people about those scenes. So, you know, let's say the build up to the draw, I'd make sure everyone tells me their version of that story. Or you know, the night before they decided to go ahead, where was everyone? What were they doing? That kind of thing. So like I'd have that structured out in my head. And
yeah,
I suppose, you know, I've been doing it now for over 15 years as well. So I'd be kind of thinking like, okay, I've learned over the years that sometimes the build up to a moment is actually worth more than the moment itself. So you're making sure like I get plenty of that. And then there's an interview methodology that I use for these kinds of stories where you're really getting people to break it down beat by beat. I call it like the blow by blow account. And it's in a kind of like almost like past present tense. So people say, I did this and then I did that. And as opposed to, you don't want it to become like too reflective. You know, I wouldn't ask people very often like how did you feel at that moment? Like I'd first want to get, you know, what almost feels to them like the boring detail. You know, where were you and what did you do? So like, oh yeah, I arrived at the house and I went up the stairs and I did this. And it sounds like very much like just process. But actually, filmmaking loves process. You know, it loves that sense of build up. Where were you? What happened? Like the little details along the way. And then when you've several characters and you're intercutting those and getting from different perspectives, it allows you to kind of like build tension or yeah, very much like build the excitement of something. So you're kind of trying to stay in the present tense of the past and not allow people to, within the interviews, to get too far ahead of themselves, you know? So yeah, so that's kind of how you approach it. So you have your kind of running order, you interview the people, you get it in as much detail as you can within each scene. Like one of the ones is where like Stefan goes to try and find the ticket. Once the draw has happened, they haven't managed to buy all the combinations. So there's still a doubt there as to whether or not they're going to be able to win, you know? So then he goes and looks for the ticket. So like, I remember even at the time, like trying to get him to give me like every detail of that. I mean, this interview took place several years ago, but I really remember that moment quite clearly of like, you know, tell me. He goes, okay, well, I went in through the door where there were all the boxes were there. I opened the box. I took out the envelope, you know, so and then when you construct that then with nicely shot scene and visuals, then and music, you're kind of like, oh my God, is the ticket going to be there? You know, so like it's a level of detail that can almost feel pedantic when you're doing it. But when you come to edit with that material, it's really great stuff, you know, and so then that's the interview process. And then what you do is you take it into the edit. So you take the interviews into the edit and you break down that whole story as they've told it, you know, and you end up with quite a long version of events, and then you start chiseling away at that. Like there was several really great scenes that we just got rid of for time. You know, I can think of 3 brilliant scenes. You know, it's funny. Someone was asking Stefan the other day about his background, and like we took a lot of that out because as colorful and fantastic as it was, it just felt like it was taking you away from the core story, you know. So you figure out what's going to be in the doc and what's not going to be in it as well as you can. And what we would often do in that situation then is we would pull visuals from a variety of places. Like we might grab some stock footage, we might grab other footage that we already have. We'll have shot a little bit of stuff along the way that we know is pretty likely to be usable. And then we sort of map out the documentary then in a kind of fairly rough cut way. And we start thinking about what each scene may look like. And then we try and come up with kind of a fairly accurate-ish list of what we're going to shoot with it. Now, that all sounds like really like organized. It's not like that completely because, you know, actually a really good editor like Nathan is, he's like, I don't just want, you know, one shot to go with that. Like, give me something to work with here. You know what I mean? Like, let's go and shoot out a bunch of stuff because I might decide within the edit that actually is a better way of cutting this together. Like, don't necessarily just do the obvious thing. You know, it's you need to be able to get images and put them together and figure out, is there another way of piecing this together that's a bit more interesting or surprising or gives a whole other layer to this? And, you know, one of the things,
do cars going into the driveway or, you know, the wall of boxes and the light coming through, like it's so cinematic that, and you feel those moments as if you're physically.
Yeah. And it's not really about the shots is what I'm trying to get at. It's also about like how you put the shots together. And I feel like watching some kind of, say, like if you look at the true crime genre, it's very much like say the thing, see the thing, you know, like if someone says the word knife, you see a shot of a knife almost, you know, and very much Nathan, you know, would say to me, oh, listen, not referencing that necessarily, but just saying I want to get away from that. Like give me some interesting stuff to work with, and let's see what we can come up with. So it's a mixture of, like, I would say, like, I see it almost like each scene is like almost like a box, and you're like throwing as much stuff into it that may be useful and relevant. You make sure you get your stuff, like, that, if there was a knife, you make sure you have a shot of a knife, and that's, there's key MacGuffins and things like that for scenes. But as well as that, give yourself something to work with outside of that, like, give yourself some room to throw stuff at the wall and so on. So we tried to do that then as well, and then it was kind of like over to the edit and start freaking it out from there.
Because there's so much, like, you have that dialogue over it, but like that pacing and the tension there's so much in terms of what you got, like, and it's all period piece because it's set so long ago. Was that, like, how long did the recreations take?
We did shoot quite a number of days, and like one of the things was, I wanted to make sure we had loads. I didn't want it to feel like we were repeating shots very often and that kind of thing, because I feel like that's something that can kind of take you out of the story. So, but also, like, I kind of had an idea of, I feel like, I always say the audience can't see what's outside the frame, so we did shoot a lot of kind of macro shots and close-ups and that kind of thing as well. So at times, I think in the edit, then we felt like things were getting too micro, you know what I mean, and started feeling too small, and you're trying to, like, and probably something I think we failed at to a certain extent is coming up with more bigger shots, and I think that was probably a budgetary thing as well. But you can do a lot if you, with a bit of imagination and a macro lens and some props. So I'd be thinking that way. I'd be like, what's just inside this frame. And like, I actually built, my dad helped me, but we built basically like a shop, which sounds amazing, but it was like incredibly basic, where I went into like a few newsagents and saw like how do they stack the confectionery and chewing gums and stuff like that. And I went online and I bought like a few chewing gum holders. And then I went to, I kind of designed on the back of an envelope, like, how could you make like a little confectionery shelf? So went to the, whatever, like Chadwick's or one of those places, and got a bunch of wood, and we cut it up and we made a couple of confectionery stands. I went to IKEA and got a couple of like, what would you call them? Like countertops. You can get them in like the cheap section at the end of IKEA. And sort of made a couple of like countertops and confectionery stands and stuff like that, and colored them different colors so they would look different depending on the shot. And then we would, like, so when you see the person coming and laying down their lottery tickets or laying down their £50 note or whatever it is, in the foreground is like maybe like an out of focus Twix or something like that, or you know what I mean? So you're kind of going like, okay, that gives it a sense of verisimilitude, reality, it's something feels like it's right. So, but like, that entire prop probably cost €60, between, or maybe €100 between everything. And then
your time, though, you built it all.
Yeah, well, we were in lockdown, so I had plenty of time and did it in the back garden. But so things like that, I think, especially for kind of docs that have reconstruction, you can do some interesting stuff and some big shots and stuff like that, but you can actually do a ton of small, really nice stuff that's so useful. And, if you're organized, you can do, like, we just did that in my little office in the old film base. In a day, we were shooting like tons of stuff because we'd have little props and little countertops and all sorts of little things, shed loads of little close-ups and macro shots and stuff like that. And I think that's stuff that you can do that's inexpensive, but can add so much just to the variety of what you have. And that's really what I wanted to achieve, was that it wouldn't feel like you were just seeing the same stuff over and over again.
And in terms of, like, do you really enjoy that? Like, are you going, oh, that's a completely, again, different muscle than if I'm documenting something that's presently happening and capturing that and putting it together almost as the edit? Or at times, is it exhausting? Or is both?
No, I absolutely love it. Absolutely love it. I just wish I was better at carpentry, because I do way more of it then, like it's, it's really, you're challenging yourself, like, to use whatever imagination you have, and everyone has imagination. So I do it in a kind of like quite structured way of thinking. So I would think, okay, this scene what does this scene require? And then I would just like really think about it over the course of a few days and write notes and go like, this kind of shot could work here, that kind of shot could work here, and really make a good list and just challenge yourself, like keep asking yourself, what other kinds of shots would work with this scene? Okay, so someone goes into a shop to buy tickets, doesn't sound like much, but like when you think about it, like you can do all sorts of things with that, even how they walk in, the angles that they walk in at. We asked a few of the kind of grocery stores around Dublin and they would let us come in and shoot shots. But like, the shot of the person with a box of tickets under their arms and you're shooting it through some broccoli or something, like, I don't know, but you know what I mean? Because we had a few shops where they had like a lot of fruit and veg out the front. That just gives you, again, another type of shot. And then how you walk in, then you're arriving, like how does the person put the box on the counter? What are the different versions of that you can come up with? And then, how you do the money, like how they pay for it. Like, okay, well, we're going to shoot that straight down, or we might shoot it from a low angle, whatever it might be. Or we might do a kind of like a little time lapse. So it looks like the money is being lashed down like really fast, because at some point in the doc, you might want to speed the pace up. So just trying to use your imagination to go like, how many different ways can I do this? Or what's the most interesting way can I do this? And it doesn't necessarily need to be, expensive or a big crew or any of those things that you normally associate with production value or production, I suppose, variety within production value. It's really like, I suppose, doing the work in your head and on paper to just go like, how many different ways how many different ideas can we come up with to shoot this documentary?
And one of the things as well that brings that element of tension so intensely was the sound. Just tell me about finding that, because I presume it just takes so long to edit that when you're editing it, then getting the mix right, the music was, again, like you're on the edge of your seat. Is that something that, again, you will kind of like leave be, or are you thinking about that the whole way as you're going along?
Yeah, well, I think Nathan is an editor that really likes to work with sound effects. So he would be putting his own stuff in just because it's the only really way you can know if it feels right. You know what I mean? If you have an idea like, well, this is going to really land if we put a certain sound with it, but it can feel like nothing without it. Sound is like, to me, just massive. I'm a ginormous fan of getting the soundscape correct, and it adds so much. Like a shot that feels like nothing without sound can sometimes feel like incredible with sound. So I'd be very much in favor of doing everything you can with sound. And I think like Nathan's really good with that too. And I suppose like at times, mostly he would find stuff online or source stuff or whatever it might be. And then from time to time, I might have a look myself and see, can I find something? Or if I have an idea that I haven't communicated to him yet, I might say, hey, have we thought about putting this kind of sound with this? It might be a bit unusual, but it might work. And, it's not necessarily the sound of the thing you're seeing. It's a more imaginative version of what that could sound like in your brain. You know what I mean? So I'd feel very strongly about that. And then even within the edit, like Nathan can't learn anything from me, frankly, but he's incredible at what he does, but there might be a portion where I might have a preference, and or just feel like, I suppose, I feel like, and he does a lot of drama, you really want to, in all my documentaries, I really want to feel like there are scenes, even, and that one scene ends before the next one begins, and that the scene is satisfying and that it has done what it needs to do. And then sometimes that gives you a real opportunity to do things with punctuation in between scenes, or like, what is your transition between these two scenes, and how's that going to work? And like often audio can be really helpful in those moments, because what you don't want is just wall-to-wall people talking. That's not cinema. That definitely is not cinema. It might be sometimes the case in television. Unfortunately, people are trying to pack so many ideas into an hour of TV, say, but I really like there to be space for sound. And and it doesn't, even that sound could be something very, very subtle, but a good example is, like a car driving off on gravel, just giving you that moment to like get that like really bassy drive off, whatever, like that. It can feel like such a nice transitional moment of like, woo, and I think it's when you're editing and when you're directing within the edit, you're sort of saying like, oh, look, I think we should leave a bit more space for that, because I think that'll be really nice there, a moment for the audience to just reflect on how far we've come. And it feels earthy and maybe builds tension or creates some kind of feeling within the audience. So like I'd be constantly thinking about that, definitely, like how can we add sound? And then we work we work with a company called Scimitar Sound, which is a company run by a guy called Dean Jones, and Jordan Mullen did the sound edit and mix in this film. And he's a youngish guy, but like he's a massive talent, and he just did a phenomenal job. And I just say to them, just go for it. Just go for it. Don't feel like you can't put sound on any part of this. When it comes down to it, we might pull that sound down in the mix, but it might still be there, and I just think like the fuller it is, particularly for like a cinematic doc, the better, so like, and yeah, I feel quite strongly about that. So yeah, and then even within that, Jordan went to town on it, and did a really phenomenal job and really thoughtful job. And even still, I would come in and say, I think we can do a bit more here, or can we add a bit of this there, or whatever it might be, and have that conversation with him. Like he's brilliant. So sometimes he'd say, no, Ross. But at the same time, yeah, it was a great collaboration. And yeah, I just love what sound can do for you.
And in terms of, okay, there's so many moving parts to something this big because it's such a big story. Were there like any moments of like pure joy and despair at different points where you're like, oh God, you don't have this? Or are you so established now that like you've been doing this for so long, you're like, okay, we don't have it, but we'll figure it out? Or was there any like of those beats where you're looking at the rough cut and you're like, ah?
I think what was tricky probably, yeah, like, I mean, the thing is with any documentary, it's, and I presume it's the same for drama people. I don't really know about fiction, but you have to accept that the story is the story as well. Do you know what I mean? So like you're kind of working within that part of it as well, that like the story is what it is, and you can sometimes feel like I'd love it to do this here, but it can't, because it is what it is. But no, overall, I mean, I feel like we generally felt reasonably good about it most of the way through. And the hard part was that we felt like there were really important scenes that we had to lose, because there are other aspects of this protagonist story that are fascinating and are really very much part of who this person becomes and their backstory and so on, but it just didn't feel like it was part of this film. And I think that was probably the trickiest part, was losing those scenes, and realizing that they had to go, and probably feeling like, we were strengthening the story. You're sort of 60% strengthening it and then 40% weakening it at the same time. So I think that was probably the hardest part, was trying to get that right, and feeling that absence, and then trying to, I suppose, paper over that gap, or make sure that the story still worked with this gap taken, this scene or portion of the scenes taken out of it, that felt like it was like you went from, instead of going A, B, C, D, you're going A to D. And when you first do it, it feels like that's a huge jump. And then you're trying in the edit to figure out how do you get from A to D in a way that's makes sense and doesn't make the audience go like, hold on a second, like surely there must be something in between those two things, so I think that was probably the hardest part along the way. And then you never feel like, I mean, I don't know how other people are, but you never 100% feel like you've nailed it, like that's for sure. You always feel like it could be better, and at some point you just, as they say, you just have to let it go out there, and that's where we are now. Hopefully people like it.
You had your screening at DIF, your premiere. What was that like on the lead up to it? And like, is that like the most rewarding moment, or are you tense going into something like that? And then what was that experience like?
Yeah, I'm really uncomfortable with all this side of it, to be honest with you. I mean, I love making the films. I quite like talking about them, but the actual screenings and the build up to them and all that kind of stuff, I'm really uncomfortable with, frankly. So I didn't actually sit in the screening at DIF. I just stayed outside. I'd actually also fallen off my bike that week and couldn't really sit down very well. So that was another good excuse. But yeah, it was probably the most tense I've ever felt going into a screening. And I just felt, I think that, like with this film, there's an element of, as we spoke about earlier, the kind of leaning into some of the thriller tropes and all that kind of stuff. And you're sensationalizing is not the right word, but you're trying to make the story feel as big as you can. Ultimately, it was a story that happened over 3 days in Ireland. where these guys try to buy every combination, and it was in the news at that time. But then ultimately everyone moves on. Like I think Bishop Casey and Annie Murphy was in the newspaper the following week. So like, you know, to most people, it was just a little curiosity. They probably forgot about it instantly, but we wanted to feel like it was the biggest thing that ever happened to these people in those 3 days, which it was, you know? So, but in doing that, you can sometimes feel like, are you almost pushing it too far, you know? And how are they going to feel when they watch it? And some of the syndicate had seen it for different reasons, and some were happy to wait. But yeah, and you're obviously dealing with, let's say there's 10 interviewees in the film. That's 10 different people, 10 different personalities, 10 different memories of what happens at that time, and that creates its own tension as well. Not like, honestly, I didn't feel like anyone was going to have a big problem with it, but there's still an underlying feeling about presenting the work to the people that are in it. And then to the audience, you know, like, what are they going to think? You haven't got a clue, you know, you really don't until you put it on there. But it went down really well, thankfully. And maybe I'm feeling slightly less tense now, but only slightly.
Well, it definitely is one to see on the big screen because it's so visual, it's so intense, it's such a big story. Yeah, what would you hope people get from it?
Well, yeah, look, I hope people have a great time. I mean, I think that's the thing. Like a lot of time with documentaries, the stories are so important and serious and moving, and it's a completely different type of feeling than you're going to get from this film, which is really, you know, it's fascinating. And, you know, we do talk about where Ireland was at the time and why that's interesting in the context of this story. But ultimately, it's a story of people trying to pull off a heist, and hopefully people really enjoy it, feel incredibly tense at times in a way that they really enjoy as well, and have a laugh along the way, and maybe makes them think a little bit about a few things about the Irish psyche. I mean, about Ireland in the 90s and what it was like, and about, you know, how do you feel about someone trying to do something like this? I mean, I think that was one of the things that really pulled me into the story was, you know, when you look back at the archive and the vox pops of the people on the streets of Dublin at the time, and I'm sure there was the same feeling all over Ireland, was like half the people felt like this was brilliant, that someone was sort of taking on the man and trying to beat the system. And then the other half felt like, well, the lottery is actually a really positive influence on Irish society, and they shouldn't be doing this. So I think that's something, like I always said when we were making it, that those are two really important things, that looking a little bit at the Irish psyche from you know, in the context of that time, which is a very different time, and secondly, that I wanted like a couple to go to the film and come out arguing about which side of the story they were on. Those are my two kind of hopes from it, and largely I think we're getting that reaction, so that's good.
Amazing. And thank you so much for chatting with us.
No worries, Jan, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for listening. So if you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, don't forget to rate, like and subscribe to Film Ireland wherever you get your podcasts, and check out filmireland.ie for articles, events, news and reviews. There you'll also be able to subscribe to our newsletter and never miss a beat.